this is probably treason when you're a film fan. For the longest time, I didn't like Westerns. It took me till my 20s till I liked Westerns, because they were always on when you were sick from school or something in the afternoon, and there were always the horrible, boring black and white ones.
Okay. So you just had a bad introduction to them, is what you'll say.
Yes, they were never fun. They were always something your grandparents would watch. But right, spaghetti westerns, the actual term, right, if we are be led to believe, was coined by the Spanish journalist Alfonso Sanchez. Funnily enough, do you know what a spaghetti western in Japan is called? It's not very clever, just...
It's not going to call it sushi western, is it?
Macaroni western. They're referring to spaghetti, Italian westerns.
Oh, I thought you meant like Japanese.
No.
I thought you were talking like Kurosawa films.
Come on.
Films like Yojimbo and things like that.
Well, they're massive influence on spaghetti westerns.
It is, yeah. In fact, I believe when I was reading, Kurosawa actually sued, I think it was either Sergio Leone or Corbucci, about ripping off Yojimbo. I think it was only because it was the Fistful trilogy, I think.
The Dollars trilogy, and I think, you're referring to the first one, A Fistful of Dollars from 1964, starring international star Clint Eastwood.
The man with no name.
Yeah, but funnily enough, this is how kind of disrespected Italian westerns were at the time. And I think it's because westerns are so Americana, it's beyond belief that prior to them taking a main stage, that an Italian would be directing them. Because when A Fistful of Dollars was released in the United States, Sergio Leone was credited as Bob Robertson. That was his anglicized name.
That's essentially Robert Robertson.
and it wasn't until A Fistful of Dollars became a huge hit that he could revert back to, look, I'm Sergio Leone.
Why would they be worried that audiences are offended that a non-American is directing a Wild West movie? Was that the whole thought process?
Well, that would happen throughout spaghetti western history, especially in the 60s. Italian actors would take on anglicized names, so there would be, something generically English sounding. So, and I think is that to trick the audience? Because you've got to remember, Italian cinema, especially genre cinema, was always seen as second class. It was always a knockoff of an American version. For example, it's the spaghetti westerns, which was a knockoff of the American westerns. You had in the 70s, the Polizio Tesci films were a knockoff of American police films and action films. So you always had this second-tier quality with Italian cinema, which has been reappraised, and that is no longer the case. People actually respect these films now.
Is it also because when you think of the names, if they see a name they don't recognize, or maybe even a name they can't pronounce, it's almost going to put them off?
I think so.
Like, what was the guy that worked with Fellini, Marcel Mastroianni?
Marcello Mastroianni.
That's how he says his name. Yeah, like, he's a great actor. I think he's absolutely fantastic.
One of the best.
It's an important influence on this film actually as well. Yes. But it's almost like you hear that name, you don't recognize him. He's not a Bogart. He's not a Lauren Bacall, Katharine Hepburn, whatever. It's like it puts them off. It takes them out of a comfort zone maybe, because a lot of these films, like the one we talk about today, they only gained recognition. They were kind of cult films. They only gained recognition later in life.
Well, they gained appraisal later in life because these were box office successes. These weren't underground films, but yes, critically they have been reappraised through the years. And I was to get a through line into this episode, I was thinking, what's one of the earliest examples? Because spaghetti westerns aren't a 60s trope.
No.
They became famous in the 60s, of course, and I couldn't exactly find when the first one, but I thought an interesting one which would tie into this episode was, and here's a nice fact I had no idea about. In 1913, there was an Italian western called The Indian Vampire, which was directed by none other than Sergio Leone's dad, Vincenzo Leone, and starred Leone's own mother, Bice Wallerin. I hope that's pronounced right.
Right. That sounds like an Ed Wood film.
It's a Western horror.
Totally legitimate. Yeah. You could even go back even further and say, like, maybe The Great Train Robbery, which is the Australian film, because that's using kind of elements of Western. So it's like when we talked about horror films, some say that film, The House of the Devil, was the original one, but then again, you get a lot of films that kind of have little elements, but it's when it coalesces into one product, people say that was the very first one.
Exactly. It's very hard to pinpoint these things, but let's explicitly now talk about 60s.
Yeah.
The 60s, we had the Three Sergios, as they were called. We had Sergio Leone, Sergio Corbucci, and Sergio Sollima.
Yeah.
Sollima is maybe not quite as regarded as the other two, though he did notably make The Big Gun Down, starring Van Cleef and Thomas Milian, which is a very highly regarded film within the spaghetti western genre. And of course, Sergio Corbucci, quote unquote, the other Sergio, as he's referred to, he's always been second tier to Sergio Leone.
I think that was the point I was going to make. When you mention Italian cinema, you mention Sergio, it's almost certain people are going to think Leone, because you think your Dollars trilogy, Once Upon a Time in America as well. It's like he was the one that made it really commercially viable, because he was the one the first to get like big recognition. It's unfortunate that you become the other somebody when you do contribute great things to the cinematic landscape.
Well, Leone and Corbucci are tied in many ways. They actually worked together for years in peplum films, and for our listeners who aren't maybe familiar with the peplum genre, it's literally the sword and sandal genres.
Okay.
And they worked together on The Last Days of Pompeii, which starred bodybuilder Steve Reeves.
Yeah, I've heard of that, yes. Do you mean sword and sandal, like kind of your Spartacus, things like that?
Yes, things like that, yeah. Okay. Italians would have their own version, and they were called peplum films.
Things that took place in environments very different to what we're talking about today, and in the last film as well, the sword and sandal epics.
And a beautiful tie-in, Wayne, to our Cannibal Holocaust episode. For years, on many films, Corbucci's frequent assistant director was none other than Ruggero Deodato.
The madman.
And there is a quote from Deodato, and he says, "Bolognini taught me elegance, Rossellini taught me how to tell a story, and from Corbucci I learnt cruelty."
That's the problem. It's the ones who are in the public eye that get the recognition, but behind the scenes, these people all work together, because you have to realize, you have to remember, if you take something like the Academy Awards, as scoffed as it is, Italy is the most successful, and when it comes to like best international films, they went, a lot of the big ones were from Italy, like France and Italy is where a lot of the big ones came from.
Well, you had the great art directors, Antonioni, you had Fellini, as we said, Marcello Mastroianni in 8.5, La Dolce Vita. These are great films. They're very different to the ones we're discussing today, but they're none other great films. Now, let's think of that, Wayne. As we were saying, you've got Leone, Corbucci, and Sollima, the Three Sergios. Now, think in the year 66 alone, you had from Leone, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. From Corbucci, Django. Sollima, The Big Gun Down.
So you could argue 66 was, in a way, the biggest single year almost for spaghetti westerns.
You definitely can't talk of Corbucci without Django. Django brought in a new era of violence to cinema. There is literally a scene in that film where a guy has his ear chopped off and is fed to him, his own ear.
Yeah, because when you look at the comparisons with Leone did get a lot of critical praise, but for a lot of his career, Corbucci was almost seen as more of an exploitation filmmaker. A lot of his films were not praised for the violence, they were derided for it.
Right, and I think Corbucci's world is vastly different to Leone's. Corbucci is, as you said, he's working very much in genre, where I think Leone is trying to elevate it to the epic, to the grand, to the spectacle. And I don't think Corbucci is necessarily interested in that. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Corbucci made, I think, 13 westerns. Leone made vastly fewer than that, because I think, as somebody said, there is no Corbucci masterpiece without one sloppy scene, but there is also not one of his weak films with one brilliant scene. Corbucci was vastly more prolific than Leone. Leone was very much, in the Tarantino mold, where everything you are is within that film, and you space them out to create, a perfect filmography, where Corbucci was, let's get this done, on to the next one, let's get this done, on to the next one. That doesn't mean he's not without talent. He's a vastly talented guy, and I think Corbucci's world is vastly summed up in his film Django, the opening to Django. You have Franco Nero playing the mysterious Django. He's black clad, he's trailing a coffin beside him. So, okay, we're automatically supposed to suspect this morbid character. He's, it holds on a long shot. There's a woman, she's being whipped by some Mexicans, a band of Mexicans. Here comes in the distance our quote-unquote white saviors in their white hats. They look very cowboy, regal. Well, they kill the Mexicans, but they also are after the girl. They have no respect for her either. Django comes in, he kills all of them. And I think this is summing up Corbucci in one sequence. The confliction between violence, beauty. Everything is mixed. There's no black and white.
Speaking of Corbucci and conflictions as well, he didn't just do westerns, because what's weird is he'll do a western movie, it'll be very violent, very bloody, it'll have scenes like you were just describing, but then he'll go over and he'll do comedies. Like he was famous for doing comedies with like Bud Spencer and Terence Hill, bloodless movies. So it wasn't like he didn't have range. He could do something over here, then he would go and he would do something over here.
Well, I think that was especially a trend in the 70s. The director Barboni done a film, They Call Me Trinity, and that kind of kicked off in the Western genre to more comedic elements. And that also starred Bud Spencer and Terence Hill. And they were taking the elements of the Western and injecting a lot of humor, a lot of fun, more, let's say, mainstream orientated.
And it was kind of, I think, a lot of it doing a lot of these westerns, because he made a lot of westerns, Corbucci, and I think it did kind of wear on him. He said at one point he grew tired of making westerns. He said, "I hate the horses in the desert. I go back to town wanting to make a film about a man who drives a car, uses a phone, and watches TV. But once I'm there, I start thinking how nothing is finer in cinema than a horseman with the setting sun and the red sky." When you think of that, you think of the mythology, the romanticism of the Western films. You think of like the classics with John Ford and starring John Wayne. But what was interesting, I think, about the spaghetti westerns is how they were often demythologized. They were de-romanticized. They kind of deconstructed the classic cowboy westerns to put this very unique spin on it. And I think that's why spaghetti westerns stand out and why they're still so influential.